So back in September of 2024, I picked up the Fuji X-T5, but at the time, I honestly could have seen myself also going with the X-T50. It was cheaper and internally had pretty much the same specs. But personally, I never make a decision on picking up a new camera or any type of piece of gear just based on specs alone. For me, it's always about the experience that I get when I'm using the camera itself. For me, the X-T5 ultimately was the better choice. This all said though, I do get why the X-T50 exists, and for a lot of people, it may actually be the better buy. So that's why in this video, I'm gonna compare the two cameras, the X-T50 and the X-T5. I'll explain why I chose the X-T5 ultimately. And of course, hopefully I can help you determine which of the two would make the most sense for you. I actually got the opportunity to use the X-T50 prior to its release back in May of 2024. And I had my hands on it for a while before it came out, so I got a good amount of experience using the camera. I also recently got to use it on loan for a project again, and got to use it as a main body for a recent road trip I took through Florida. So collectively, I've spent a couple months now using the X-T50, and mostly for, I guess, street photography, travel work, and I guess some landscapes mixed in there as well. That said, when I was making a decision between this camera and the X-T5, it was a close call. With the X-T50 being priced at $1,400, at least the time that I was looking at it, while still giving you those flagship level specs, it has the same 40 megapixel sensor and the same X processor 5 as the X-T5. It was a tougher choice for me than you'd think. I mean, even when I look at it, to me, it just screams streamlined flagship specs. It's a compact Fuji with, again, flagship level internals. And I do mean that sincerely. From that perspective, I do think this camera is actually a pretty good deal. Where the differences come into play for me were the physical characteristics of these cameras, the housing per se. Might be tough to tell here, but the X-T50 is slightly smaller than the X-T5. And I think for some, this could definitely be a plus, especially as something that you maybe want to carry around every day, or you want to use as, say, like a travel camera. Just in holding the cameras, I definitely have a preference for this size, the X-T5's shape and everything. There's something about it that just feels a little more robust, I guess. And I think that robustness is twofold. I think it comes from the difference in the shape of the cameras. And again, as I mentioned, that size, which for me, it's just a preference, not necessarily a negative at all. Just something that between the two cameras, I ultimately went with the X-T5. If you look closely at it, you'll see that the X-T50's body is actually pretty rounded off, like on the edges, which in my experience, you know, isn't necessarily a deal breaker, but did make it harder to grip the camera when I was out using it. It just made it harder to hold on to it, especially for longer periods of time. Like if I went out for a longer day of walking around taking photos, I did feel like it was a little tougher to hold on to. So Fuji as a brand obviously has a pretty big community of straight out of camera shooters. So the new film simulation dial on the top of this camera and the one that they also added to the XM5 that recently came out, those don't come as a surprise to me, honestly. But I will say personally, as somebody that shoots mostly raw images, I really didn't use the dial all that much when I was using the X-T50. Adding this new dedicated film simulation dial did require them to replace another dial, and in this case, it was the ISO dial. As I mentioned, I shoot raw almost 100% of the time, and on top of that, I always shoot fully manual. So losing the ISO dial for me was actually a bigger blow, I think, because on the X-T50, you have to use the internal menus to set your ISO. You can call me a romantic if you will, but a big reason why I started using Fuji cameras and why I fell in love with them was because even though they're digital and you're getting digital images, I like to think they provide a closer to analog feel throughout that photography process. And a big part of that feel comes from the physical control you have over the different settings from the exposure triangle, such as ISO or shutter speed. So again, I prefer to have a physical dial or some physical representation of each of these settings on my camera. Now, if I was a straight out of camera user or I was really into the film recipes, I would probably be using this film simulation dial a little bit more often, and the lack of that physical ISO value wouldn't impact me that much. So another thing to note about the X-T50 is that it doesn't have a D-pad on the back. It just has a joystick for control, which basically limits you to controlling the menus with either that joystick or I guess touchscreen, but I always disable that, honestly. So using that might be a little annoying if you're used to having a nice D-pad. I mean, the X-T5 does have one on the back here, which we'll talk about later. But yeah, not a huge deal, but you know, just a little bit of a preference issue again for me, something to think about. The X-T50 has a single axis tilt screen. What that means is I can really only pull it out like one way. So I can bend it for like a waist level horizontal shot. Can't really pull it out vertically like other screens come out this way. And so you could do, a vertical shot from below you or, above your head. The X-T5 screen, on the other hand, does provide more of that flexibility. You have the standard axis and you have the vertical axis as well. So in future iterations of the X-T50, I'd love to see them add some more rotation ability on that back screen, but it's more of a convenience factor. Having that extra rotation is a nice to have for sure. A lot of my criticisms of this camera are really just rooted in personal preferences and are not going to reflect what a lot of the people watching this video are going to think about these cameras, and that's totally fine. That said, again, I want to completely and fully emphasize the X-T50 in general, in my experience, is a really good camera, but I did pick up the X-T5 for a number of specific reasons, and I want to touch on some of those specifically. Even though the X-T5 was more expensive, I think at the time it was $1,700 new, although I did buy this one used. Shout out Faisal, by the way. My past experience using the X-T3 and the chances that I've got in the past to play around with both the X-T4 and X-T5, these experiences show me that the few extra $100 would definitely be worth it. They'd essentially be an investment in a shooting experience that would better suit my style, per se. But the question is, what are the specific things that I noticed about the X-T system that ultimately led to this choice? To start, we mentioned this with the X-T50, but the X-T5 is just a little bit bigger than the X-T50, which doesn't really matter, but what does matter to me is the shape of the camera. That matters a lot to me. So you can see that the X-T5 does have a pretty deep grip on the right side of the camera. And using it, I found that personally, it just fits my hands better. It's easier for me to hold. And that's especially the case during really long days of shooting, like if I'm walking around the city or if I'm traveling and I'm holding it kind of by my side for long periods of time as I'm walking or whatever. That grip was definitely a big deciding factor between the two, just from a comfortability perspective, if that makes sense. The X-T5 also does have a more standard both button and dial layout. We have that staple ISO dial on the top, staple shutter speed dial, obviously the exposure compensation dial as well. Then on the back, we have what I like to think of again as like a more standard Fujifilm button situation. We have a standard D-pad. We still have a joystick option. So a big reason why I like this layout in general is the physical ISO dial. That's definitely something I really want to have on my cameras. And so obviously I'm glad that the X-T5 has that. I want to revisit the tilt screen as well. So again, the tilt screen on the X-T5 does have sort of multiple ways to articulate itself. So you can, do waist level horizontal shots. You can go above your head and do a horizontal shot. You can do above your head vertical, or you can flip it up and do waist level vertical as well. In my experience using the camera so far, it's just been really convenient to have these different angles that I can rotate the screen with so that I can shoot things from above my head and below my head in both portrait and horizontal orientations. Again, it's just convenient to have. The X-T5 does have weather sealing technology, whereas the X-T50 doesn't, from my understanding. And this is actually pretty important to me personally as a professional and somebody shooting in a lot of different lighting and weather conditions. I don't want to have to shy away from a rainy day or, a blizzard, snow, but I do want to be confident that bringing a camera out into those conditions isn't going to completely destroy it. So this actually became a pretty big factor in my decision, especially living local to New York. My goal while being close to this area is to try to capture the city in as many different conditions as possible, and it would have sucked to not be able to fulfill that idea. So that's definitely an important factor in this decision for me. The still/movie dial is the feature on the X-T5 that took it from being what I think is a great camera to a definite everyday carry main body camera for me. When I'm out on a long day of shooting, I usually only bring one camera with me. I just find that when I'm switching between multiple cameras and lenses and all those sorts of things, I miss moments a lot. I get almost distracted by the gear itself and kind of the decision of which one to pick up at that moment. Because I'm doing YouTube content, some short form stuff, I have client work, I need to be able to do video work on the fly as well. So whatever camera I do decide to bring with me has to have fast hybrid capability of some kind. Now with past cameras, it was kind of annoying to switch between photo and video modes, but this switch on the front here makes it instant. And it will even preserve settings respectively between the two modes. Maybe my shutter speed on stills mode is 1/500th of a second, but my shutter speed on movie mode is 1/48th of a second. Those will stay where they are regardless of of what I'm doing on either mode. So on the X-T50, you would have to go through drive modes to switch from photo to video, which is fine. I mean, that's pretty common on a lot of cameras, but in my experience, that does cause me often to miss moments, whether I am switching from video to photo or vice versa. So having this still/movie dial is definitely a pretty big win for the X-T5 in my book. The X-T5 uses this battery here. It's a newer battery, whereas the X-T50 still kind of uses the old, I like to call it the dinosaur battery. And I have noticed a significant increase in the battery life for sure, but this isn't personally something I care that much about. Sort of a nice to have, not necessarily even a strong preference. And that's mainly because when I go out shooting, I usually bring a bag with a stockpile of batteries in it. So I've never really ran out of juice when I was out on the go. But if you want to have more of a minimal kit, you don't like carrying extra batteries with you, the X-T5 definitely does have a significantly and noticeably longer battery life, at least in my experience so far. It's a nice to have. For you, it might be a necessity, but for me, it's just a nice to have. So the X-T5 mirrors the X-T3 almost identically. And that was my main camera for like 4 years. So since I already have a comfort level with the X-T system in general, all those small differences between the X-T5 and the X-T50, things like the lack of that deeper grip, the rounded edges on the camera itself, the layout changes, the replacement of the ISO dial, the removal of the D-pad, those tilt screen restrictions, those things were all quite noticeable to me. But perhaps for you, if you've never used a Fuji, or if you have experience with a different Fuji, like maybe the X106 or the XS20 or something on the lineup, and then you get your hands on an X-T50, you might have a different experience. For me, the minute that I picked up the X-T5 for the first time, it felt like an extension of a camera I had been using for years prior. And honestly, that's a big part of what sealed the deal for me and why I pulled trigger on buying that camera over the X-T50. But if you pick up an X-T50, you may find it more comfortable for you. You just have to try it. So then the question is, which should you get? Hopefully I've emphasized enough that it's going to be about what's right for you, not for me or someone else. At the end of the day, I was personally really happy using both cameras. I got good images I really like with both cameras and had no major issues with either. But it just came down to some minute preferences that I've developed over time. And those were mostly on the physical side of things, the things that impacted how the camera felt when I used it. In a general sense, if you only care about having a lightweight, compact setup and you don't mind a few design trade-offs, a few design losses per se, I think the X-T50 is probably a perfect fit for you. But if you're in my shoes where maybe some of the physical things that I mentioned about the X-T5 really will matter to you, or maybe you just want some more robust controls, like I mentioned the still and movie dial, for example, then the X-T5 may be worth the money. The X-T5 for me was the right choice, but the X-T50 was not far behind. And if I had gone with the X-T50, I'm more than confident I would have been happy with that as well. This all said though, if you own either camera or you're in the market for either of these cameras and you're trying to figure out which one's the right fit for you, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what I've talked about in this video. Definitely let me know your opinions down in the comments below. As always, subscribe for more episodes and I will see you in the next one. Peace.